Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome back to the SKYLIT Books podcast. My name is Nat, and I am your host today, and we are so excited to welcome Jessica Johns to talk about her debut novel, Bad Cree. Jessica Johns is a Nehio auntie and member of the Sucker Creek First Nation in Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta. Her writing has been published in numerous literary magazines, and her short story, Bad Cree, won the 2020 Writers' Trust McClelland and Stewart Journey Prize. Thanks for being here, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
Do you want to start by reading a little bit of the book for us to kind of set the scene?
I'd love to, yeah. I'm going to read a section that occurs like pretty early on in the novel. And I really love reading this section because it's the first introduction to Mackenzie's Cookum. Mackenzie is the main character, and Cookum in Cree means grandmother. And Cookum in this novel is one of my favorite characters, so I love reading the passage with her. By the shore, me, Tracy, and Cassidy were digging holes next to the water. Sabrina sat against the cluster of jack pines, reading a book about trees. She was already reading at a grade 7 level and read anything about plants she could get her hands on. I don't think I ever saw her that summer without a book in her hands. We looked up when we heard a crunch coming from the trail that led to our campsite. Cookum emerged from the woods like a creature from the deep. With a cigarette in her hand, she swatted at the mosquitoes in front of her while pulling a giant blue wagon behind her. Cookum was shorter than all of her daughters, though she didn't look it. And she was all teeth. Her real teeth rotted out as a kid, and when she got dentures, they were too big and too white for her mouth. I think I fell in love with her teeth first, how they were so even and moved to the sound of the room. She used to call them a weapon. Stronger than regular teeth, she would say. Can bite through bone. Don't ask me how I know. Her party trick was putting her teeth in our water cups when we weren't looking, laughing when we'd spot the enamel staring back as we put our lips to the glass. She wheeled the wagon over to the campfire and whistled at us, even though we were already watching her. We normally were whenever she walked into a space. She waved her hand in front of the wagon like a magician, the smoke from her cigarette curling around her body. We all dropped the sticks we were using as shovels and ran over to her. Sabrina left her book right on the ground. Mom, hearing the whistle, came out from inside one of the tents she was setting up. Holy, where the hell did you get that? Cookum smirked over her shoulder at my mom while her grandkids circled her in hugs. Cookum has her ways. Auntie Verna popped her head out of the tent next to Mom's. There's no way that's going to fit all those kids. They're not babies anymore, you know. Watch your tongue, Cookum said, taking a drag of her cigarette. These babies will fit just fine. I breathed her in as she talked to my mom and aunties. Even with all us kids pushing against her, she was sturdy like the trees she just came out of. Her soft stomach moved under my head as I pressed into her harder. Okay, let's take this out for a spin. She grabbed Sabrina by the hand and helped the rest of us get into the wagon. The cigarette, mostly ash, dangled from the side of her mouth, moving up and down as she talked. She started wheeling us back to the trail. Don't worry about us, Mom yelled. We'll make sure to get everything cleaned and set up. That's my girl, Cookum waved behind her. We're just gonna walk for a couple high prairie minutes. That's what Cookum used to call walking the trails through the woods. Mom rolled her eyes. Well, how long is that? The minutes take as long as they need to. A minute to her was the distance between two trail openings on the lake. No two openings in particular. It was just the amount of time it took to get from one trail leading from the woods to the water and the next one. Sometimes these openings were only a few feet apart. Sometimes they took forever. This is how I learned the trails around the lake, how I started to make myself a part of their paths. Before we had the wagon, we'd just walk, and she'd point out plants and what they could do, tell us stories and jokes. Wop and Wask, she once said, pointing at the ground to a yellow stalk sprouting tiny white flowers growing in a plume. Your mom's favorite. Fitting. Yarrow is stubborn, like her. Only grows where it wants, doesn't take orders from anybody. Sabrina wrote down everything Cookham told us about plants. She even drew sketches and eventually started painting them. Me, Cass, and Tracy were more interested in her stories. Sometimes she'd take us on a long walk right before we were supposed to be leaving, when Mom and the aunties were packing up the campsite. By the time we got back, it would be late. We only walked a couple minutes, Cookham would say when Mom got mad at her. Mom shook her head. A couple minutes, my ass, she said as she started to unpack, setting up camp again for us to stay one more night. It's not the only way to measure time, Cookham said once. Sometimes time is measured in the days between phone calls with your Cookham, which should never be very many. Sometimes it's the measure of a heartbeat.
Thank you so much for reading and for that little section in particular, because I also loved Cookham so much. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say that when the story starts and is taking place, Cookham has already passed, but she still feels so present in the story. Like you were reading that passage and I had to remind myself that you were reading a memory.
Yeah.
Because she still felt so alive in so many of those parts. But I wanted to start by asking you how this book came to be, since it started as a short story. So what was the story like when it came to be? And like, was it Mac was the character there, or maybe she wasn't quite Mac yet? And then how you decided what a larger, more open version of this story would look like.
Yeah, so this did start as a short story, and I feel like a really big part or big reason for it growing into the novel that it is that I kind of let this story tell me what it needed and wanted to be. So when I had this idea for the story and I wrote it as a short story, but it didn't feel done. I kept thinking about it. The characters really stayed with me. Mac was in the initial short story version, but she wasn't fully fleshed out. And it just, the character, they kept banging at my door, and I just knew that the story was telling me that it needed to be fleshed out, that these characters deserved more time on the page, that they deserved growth. And I just listened to that and built it out in the ways that felt meaningful. And it was challenging in a lot of ways, because short stories and novels are two very different beasts. And building out sections of scenes and things like that really really forced me to do a lot of interesting craft work that I was very excited to do. And I think in the end, like, really became what it was asking to be in the first place.
Speaking of like the craft of it, since this is your first novel, did you know that were you interested in focusing either on short stories or novels in your writing? Or have you focused or leaned towards one or the other? Because I think some people might say they either set out to write stories or they know they want to write a novel. But you had this kind of unique experience where you wrote a story and then realized that it needed to be more. And a lot of times I feel like people do that, but they're more prone to letting it go for whatever reason. And I love that you talk about it telling you that it wasn't done. And that's also for everyone who goes to read it once it is out. We'll see that that's a big part of the story as well. I feel like listening to what everything and everyone around you is telling you about what they need.
Yeah, and I think, I think that's very true. I think a lot of this story is about gut feeling and listening to your gut feeling and um, giving validity to gut feeling and inherent knowing. And I think that, I mean, I love writing short stories. I love reading short stories. It's a form that I find really exciting and really interesting and full of so much possibility. And um, that is why I wrote the short story first, is because I love the form. So I didn't initially set out, thinking I'm going to write a novel. And I I think that, yeah, I think that listening to that um, feeling that it wasn't in the form that it was supposed to exist in, um, was, yeah, part of that gut feeling approach that I am happy I listened to.
And then speaking of the gut feelings, I loved this one section when Max starts first having her dreams, and she's trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Um, and she is trying to do research and she goes out and she's looking at different sort of superhero stories and origin stories for if something's happening, well, what caused it to happen? Um, and then she kind of takes a minute to ask herself, well, why was my first assumption that something had happened to me in order for these things to happen rather than they're happening because of something that is innately a part of me already? Um, and I think that that is a very common uh, path for women to take, especially, and women of color. When anything happens for them, it didn't come from something that they already are, but came from whatever resources they have access to or their relationships with other people. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about highlighting that and making Mac has to go on her journey to figure that out and realize that this is a part of her identity. And I have another question to build off of this with, but I'd love to start by having you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's exactly right. That's so true. Often, I think it's very common for marginalized groups, particularly ones that with varying intersections of identity, to, when experiencing something awe-inspiring or experiencing some sort of, any yeah, big thing, to attribute it to something outside of themselves. Um, and like imposter syndrome comes a lot with that as well, right? And that is because of um, that is an effect, that is a long-term effect of colonialism and living under capitalism, I think. Um, and in the story, actually, it's mentioned a couple of times, kind of going back to, it's not a story about superheroes, but there are a couple of mentions of superheroes and origin stories of, like, what why this is happening. And of course, because Mackenzie is disconnected from her own cultural knowledge, a lot of her own cultural knowledge, the first thing that she turns to is, like, pop culture, but also, the colonial ways of figuring stuff out, which is, like, she goes to the internet, which sometimes is helpful for her, goes to stories she already knows, but again, are more colonial stories. And they don't fit, they don't work for her, they don't make sense for what she's going through. And it's not until she goes home and she hears stories from her own family, from her own community, of their origin stories of dreaming, of these sort of innate abilities that these women have, that it clicks. And she's like, oh, this has been living in us for a very long time. And because of oppression, we have not spoken about it to each other. We have not fully embodied what this thing could potentially be or do for us. And, that's it's kind of sad that, they have gone a big portion of their lives not really knowing this about themselves. And again, that's uh, uh, a violence of colonialism, but it's also this empowering moment where they get to figure out what, a superhero, or what origin stories that do culturally make sense and are meaningful to them. And, going back to, teachings from themselves and their family, and what has been living inside of them this whole time. Um, and a big part of that too is, like, I really wanted to highlight, because there is a lot of intergenerational trauma that Indigenous peoples hold and pass down in many ways, because of violences we've experienced by the colonial government and policies and legislature laws, current and past. And also there's a lot of generational magic. There's generational love and there's generational joy that also lives in us, that we pass down, that is there for us to delve into and embody. And I think those two things can and do exist simultaneously.
And I knew that you would lead me into my next question, which was, or thing I wanted to talk about, which was um, both the idea that you are protecting people by keeping the truth from them, um, and how that so quickly backfires when people are either isolated or oppressed and then do not share those things with each other. Because as you were saying, Mackenzie was not home, she was away from home, and her dreams get so bad that she decides to go home because that's the only option left. But when she first calls her one auntie to let her know what's going on, it sort of begins this chain of, okay, we're gonna have to start talking about this, because she sits down with her aunties and they have all had dreams. Her cousin has had dreams. Her mom did have dreams and has had to deal with her dreams in certain ways. Her sisters have dreams. And so there, like you said, is this empowerment and this magic in just uttering the truth. And Mackenzie says that a lot throughout the book, that she's holding on to this, does not want to say it, can't say it. It's just stuck in her throat. And the second she does, there is a lot of pain and trauma that she has to work through, um, which is the beauty of her story here. But she's able to do it once she just simply acknowledges that she's having these dreams. And there was something so magical and beautiful about them sitting around the table. Auntie Verna telling her what her dreams were like, her mom telling her about her dream experiences, and her cousin Cassidy as well. Um, there was so much love in that action too, of, like you said, validating everyone else's experiences and not saying, well, those dreams don't matter, or that's not real life. That doesn't have anything to do with your present. So go and live your life and figure out a way to move past it, which is so often the answer. So making the space for that was sort of the beginning of her journey to doing what she needed to do.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for saying that. I think it was really important for me that this thing happened with these women where once they did, because naming their truth, telling the truth of what happens with all of them is incredibly difficult because of so many reasons. So that struggle is there, but it was really important to me that once they did do this, that they believed each other immediately. There was no point where somebody is questioning somebody else's reality and the things that are happening to them. And I think again, just the it was just important that these women were believing these other women and that their experiences were being validated. And though it took them a little bit to get there, that belief in their truth and the validity of their experiences was just like, I didn't want the conflict, any of the conflict or anything to be around like somebody not believing and then having to go through, because this is many horror stories have this trope
Yeah.
where they tell there's this thing happening and usually the man is like, that's not, no, that's not happening, and then the conflict is in like the tension is in getting this person to believe you. And I didn't want that to be the case. Instead, I was like, where can the conflict be and the tension be when you are believed immediately and you have to figure this out together? And it's still very terrifying because of the outside forces you're dealing with and also these internal conflicts that they're still strained relationships.
Yeah, and those I hadn't really considered that because it felt so maybe it was so refreshing in the way that it didn't feel forced that I didn't recognize that immediately, that that conflict wasn't there, um, because it was imagining that someone says something and you're immediately believed, which never happens.
Yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
that was, that is so refreshing, and, in terms of the family dynamics and the intergenerational dynamics too, I loved that one of Mackenzie's sort of issues that she has to figure out, because she moved away from home after certain tragedies and then sort of isolated herself there. Something that she's often talking about is sort of twofold. One, that um, with her sisters growing up, there would not be enough love to go around, and that she had to sort of create situations that would allow for her to be loved, because the well of love that people had would eventually run dry. Um, and she sort of has to grapple with that belief that she grew up with. And then the other one uh, is that also, oh, yeah. And then once she does get home, um, she wants to be loved so badly. She needs to be loved because she's in this place where she is lost and feeling hopeless, but also she hasn't been around and she has to sort of work for that love, and realizing that she has to repair these relationships. These people aren't gone, they're still here for her, but she has to repair them, in order to receive that love. And she's a little not quite stubborn in that sense,
Mitch is
following
a bit.
yeah, her mom's path with the yarrow, that she's stubborn. Just I mean, there's your generational right there,
Yeah.
that she's similar to her mom, but, um, there were really interesting, ideas about what isolation sort of does to you, in terms of how you view the love you feel like you should receive, and part of that also goes to the fact that she's a sibling of twins, so she was also sort of outside that dynamic as well. I'd love to to talk about that a little.
Yeah, I think that, there are a couple of things going on with that. The first is that this idea that she grew up with, that there was love, that there was a finite amount of love, is again, that's intergenerational. That's trauma. That is, not, there's no indication that any outside family member or outside element gave her that idea. It is just this feeling she has. And because of that, I think she becomes really avoidant, which is why she runs away. Even when she goes home, she has a very hard time reconnecting, and has a hard time accepting love. That's a huge part of it. And I think that what I feel is really important is that the love that is there with her family is absolutely always there. There's no such thing in this family as conditional love. Like, she's only going to be loved if whatever. She's going to be loved regardless. But she's also not without accountability. She has herself done things that have hurt her family, isolating herself, cutting off a part of herself, all that really damaged the family, who had already really lost a lot. And she has to contend with that. So I really wanted to explore, like, what does accountability look like that is still really full of love, that isn't carceral, that isn't like, you're no longer a part of the family because you've done this, this, and this. And the isolation that she feels is self-imposed. It's not something the family puts on her. So, she has to grapple with a lot. She has to grapple with, a lot of these also avoidant responses are also trauma responses. All the family members have responses to Tracy, her sister, has, trauma responses very different to Mackenzie. And though that's true, it still doesn't mean that her response still hurts people. So it's really about how they come together and all of that, and her trying to grapple with accepting love and also accepting that she has work to do to repair relationships that she's been a part of harming. And another part of that is, especially in Cree and for Nehiawak, community is really important. And, the concept of the, like, what is it called? The family that is just like the parents.
Nuclear.
The nuclear family is like not something that's not really it, and so this is why, her cousin is as much of a sister to her as her sisters, who are her sisters, technically her half sisters, but they would never say that. They wouldn't even consider that they were only half, her aunts help raise her just as much as her parents. Like, these are really tightly and intricately webbed family ties. And when she is removed from it, when she removes herself from it, she experiences loneliness in a very deep and scary way, that the things that happen with her dreams happen when she's alone and when she's back with her family. They don't go away, but her experience of them and how she deals with them is very different. And that is just because, the idea of being in isolation and reconnecting with your community, and whatever that community means for people also, that doesn't always mean blood relation. um, is they're very different experiences, and I really wanted to highlight that.
Well, and I feel like this was a another book that I've read recently that was sort of a great example. I don't know if it's just the way that time is moving nowadays, which is at a weird uh pace and
Yeah.
uh time, but that you're writing these books and then they don't come out for a little while, and so many things happen and so much time passes between then and when people can get their hands on them. Yet this book, along with a few others I've read, have felt so much like a thing that I needed in this moment, which was that reminder of community and our still sort of feelings of isolation through the pandemic, and just in general figuring out how to be in community and what community looks like again. So that is something that I really loved as a sort of through line of this story, and I'd love to hear what you want people to sort of take away from this, along with that idea of reconnecting and listening, um and what else you hope people get when they read this book.
Yeah, I think that particularly, in the time we're in, which is, I mean, the pandemic is not over. It's still something, we're navigating in our own lives, what it means to stay safe and keep your community safe, and also like stay connected to community, how everyone has had to navigate what that looks like in the lockdown stages. It was really interesting to see how people came together or didn't, in keeping a community that was still online, or what have you. And I think one of the biggest things for me is, and particularly the part of Mackenzie being alone, like I expanded that and wrote much of that in isolation. I was in isolation, and that was a very scary time, for everyone. And I think that connection to community is incredibly important, and I think it's life-saving, and it looks different for everybody. There are, especially for like queer Indigenous kids, queer Indigenous youth, or like queer youth in general, sometimes connection to your community can look different, and it can be community and people you choose. It might not be blood relation, as I said before. In Vancouver, Mac has a very close friend, Jolie, who, Mac really is her only connection to community. And it is, I think, in many, many ways life-saving for Mackenzie. So I just think that, I mean, if anything, I think connection is really important. I think that's where love and joy is. And that does require, like, being in community is like a lot of responsibility. It's not just, as Mackenzie learns when she goes home, it's not just receiving love with giving nothing in return. It requires work, and you to listen, and you to show up for other people as much as you're expecting or hoping people will show up for you too. It's a act of generosity, love, and reciprocity that is always, it's continuous. It is not something that ends. It's a process.
It is, and I think and I hope that everybody else gets that from this story as well. And I tried to keep we didn't talk about like the horror elements as much in the thrillers, but I wanted to keep those things for everyone who's going to read this book to experience for themselves. So on January 10th, or around this episode will air, you can grab a copy of Bad Cree at SKYLIT Books. And thank you again so much to our guest, Jessica Johns, for joining us.
Thank you so much
today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SKYLIT Books podcast series. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode or others, please visit skylitbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.